Hello everyone, hope you're all having a pleasant day and a great DevGAMM so far. My name is Khoroshev, I work at tinyBuild. I am what is usually referred to as a generalist artist, I suppose, which means I do a lot of different things at various stages of the studio's art creation pipeline. Today I'll be making an art review for a game that stood out to me the most at DevGAMM, which is a game with a wonderful title of Apopia Prologue. I'm going to go over it with a slightly critical eye and talk about a few things that may help improve the game's visuals, and hopefully it'll be useful to both this project and maybe to similar projects for those of you in the audience. Apopia Prologue is a free demo for a PC game called Apopia Sugar-Coated Tale. It's a quirky comedy adventure game with a lot of charming characters and a dark sort of narrative twist to it. It's currently in development by Quillo Games, which from my understanding is mostly just two people, one artist, one programmer. If it looks like your cup of tea, make sure to go and wishlist their game on Steam. I'm sure it will be greatly appreciated. Since this is a narrative-driven game, be warned that I will be picking my examples from everywhere in the prologue, including the ending, so spoiler warning for everything ahead. First of all, I feel like I should start this review by saying that I've had a good time playing the demo, and what's already there is a very solid experience, both visually and in just about every other department. So my honest personal / professional opinion on it is that it's fine, and there aren't any actual incredibly glaring flaws you need to worry about too much. That said, there are obviously a few things that caught my attention regarding the art style. If I could describe my biggest grievance with it, it would probably be the overall inconsistency. The game's presentation through trailers and screenshots makes a decent job of giving you an impression of what kind of game this is, but leaves you kind of confused in terms of what's actually happening and what kind of setting this is. I was especially confused to hear that the team wanted the game to feel like a playable 90s cartoon, because to me it didn't really feel like it did anything to associate itself with them, at least with its art direction. 90s cartoons, at least those of North American variety, have a very distinct look and feel to them. From character designs to backgrounds to color schemes, it's a very strong aesthetic that's hard to mistake for something else. You couldn't possibly confuse any of these with Adventure Time. They're entirely their own category. The protagonist does look like she wouldn't be out of place in something like Pepper Ann or Doug, but that is honestly just about the only thing in all of the prologue that distinctly feels like it's trying to be evocative of that era of animation. And I know that this might be a weird detail to latch onto, and the 90s cartoons comment might have been just something thrown in as a closest point of reference, but this is closely related to my original issue, which is you have to be consistent about your art style, and that comes first of all from knowing exactly what you want from it and why you're using this one thing as an inspiration but not this other thing. If you are deliberately aiming for the 90s, I would heavily recommend researching something like Earthworm Jim, Day of the Tentacle, or just about any of the Sam & Max games. All nail their visual styles perfectly, and the latter two have an added bonus of being beloved adventure games, so there's definitely something you could learn there. Apopia looks like it draws more from contemporary cartoons, and so it would be probably a good choice to limit your references to more recent shows, especially if you're trying to go for a younger audience that doesn't necessarily remember about biker mice from Mars. Characters are very obviously this game's strongest suit. They're simple, but there's no doubt that they were designed this way to be easier to animate. These designs are colorful, fun to look at, and make a good job of hinting at the personalities behind them. But when you look at these characters together like this, it's actually kind of clear that they lack consistency that would tie them all closer together. What you see on the left is a fragment of one of the official screenshots for the game on Steam, but if you were to see these characters in some kind of other context, not sort of bundled together, you probably wouldn't even know that they're from the same universe, let alone the same piece of media. They all have different line weights, different eye designs, different rules for how shapes go into each other. So obviously none of this is strictly necessary to have a pleasing art style, and you can easily find examples of gorgeous cartoons breaking all of these for various occasions. Besides, you can always explain the inconsistencies by how, all of the characters shown are different species. But your assets do need to look like they are smaller parts of a bigger whole, and making your characters share similar design traits is a pretty easy way to make that happen. What I've tried to do here is to sort of average out everyone's facial features and outline width, and you can already hopefully see that it's starting to look like a more cohesive picture. Like, you can still see that it's not an actual screenshot from an actual cartoon, but it's sort of getting there. And all I really did was introduce a few commonalities to the mix. Of course, what I came up with is obviously just a very off-the-wall example and shouldn't be taken as an exact way to follow this advice. I've noticed that even some of your own existing key art manages to better visually unite these characters. So maybe just apply something you've already solved to the game. I was a little bit hesitant about bringing up any of my issues with characters at all, considering how many frames you would have to manually redraw in order to do literally anything about the existing sprites. But my suggestion for addressing this concern, if you choose to do so, would be to maybe just establish guidelines for designing future characters and avoid making this a bigger problem than it has to be. Environments of Apopia are just as charming as its inhabitants, but they do often suffer from a lack of clarity. For example, this is one of the first areas you see after leaving the Ice Cave tutorial level, and while it already has a good atmosphere to it, it's actually kind of hard to tell what any of this really is and why it's depicted the way that it is. Everything has a very unusual design and little to no indication as to what this design is trying to accomplish in this scene, and because of that it just feels like you've stepped into a collection of random shapes and colors rather than a magical world. It doesn't feel like it was concepted with a purpose in mind. Even if your world is supposed to look very abstract, alien and weird, you can still make it look better by applying a lot of the same principles you already apply to any painting. One of the more powerful principles is to always let different parts of your environment be affected by each other in regards to just about everything you can think of. If you have fog in the background, why not add some of it to the foreground? If you use bubbly squiggly lines for the bush, use bubbly squiggly lines for the grass and for the moss and for everything else. And why would you have one weird palm tree when you can have 4 of them and in different places? And now it already gives off this impression that it's an actual tree that's native to the local ecosystem. So in short, try not to use anything once, not color, not shape, not visual effect. Always use it somewhere else on the same screen and it will just immediately look much nicer. Light sources are obviously a big part of the equation as well. Even in overcast areas, establishing a consistent direction where light comes from will go a long way in tying your environment together. And even if you have a light source that's very small and dim and shouldn't realistically be given enough light to cast it on nearby objects, have it affect the world around it anyway, because you can get away with a lot of stuff using cartoon logic. And I do realize that this first chapter was supposed to be kind of dark and mysterious, and a lot of the objects are left sort of deliberately strange and ambiguous for the final climactic reveal that you've fallen into a frozen yogurt-themed land, or at least I assume that's what it was. But the line between looking mysterious and being weird, incomprehensible, and uninviting can be very easily crossed. There aren't really any major clues that what you're seeing is somehow just a nighttime scene. It's clearly shown that the sun was still up when the protagonist fell underground. It didn't seem like a whole lot of time has passed between when we landed and when we woke up in the ice caves, and so I've honestly thought that this is an Undertale type scenario and it's all just a big cave system and it's just always dark in here, because of course it is. I didn't have a reason to believe that what I'm seeing isn't fully indicative of what the rest of the game will look like. Unfortunately, not all of the players will actually finish the first chapter or recognize subtle hints, and I think it's better to put your best foot forward by showing the best art you have in the first minutes of the game. Which sounds like a good point to mention that I have no idea what's happening at the very beginning of Apopia, where we walk along a path covered with some solid black shapes, and then we look up and see another solid black shape on top, and it disappears and the ground starts shaking and we're teleported to the other side of the mountain, I guess, and make a decision to fall into a pit for some reason. I kind of had to Google a playthrough of the intro just to make sure my game didn't glitch out and that yes, that is in fact how the intro is supposed to play out. How easy it is to understand the visuals in your game is not a separate conversation from how the game plays. Your art is always connected to game design, and a lack of clarity will have a negative impact on gameplay. For example, I've genuinely thought that touching any of these spiky rocks will somehow damage my character, and that red glowing lights on trees are a part of a puzzle I need to solve to progress. Or, for example, take a look at these two nearly identical bottom sections of the screen. Could you guess which of these is a pathway to a new location and which is just an unfortunate arrangement of bushes? Well, I couldn't either, and while it's not incredibly unintuitive when you're actually playing, it did make me hug the floor for the rest of the game in fear of missing out on hidden areas. There's also this strange feeling of emptiness that a lot of the environments have, and I'm not sure how much of it was intentional. When you're not in a forest, a cave, or a house, you're just standing on some kind of purplish, greenish hill that looks like either a lifeless desert or a radioactive wasteland. Even the house interior areas that are supposed to be, I guess, cozy and lived in, feel like they only have the bare minimum amount of objects for the player to interact with, or for it to pass as living quarters. No household items in places they're not supposed to be, no pictures on the walls, no shelves, no anything. Doesn't feel like anyone actually lives there. There's a lot of interesting world building and storytelling that can be done by fleshing out the backgrounds. Even if it is a radioactive wasteland, there are always things you can populate your environments with that aren't just three similar looking bushes and rocks. Even some pebbles or tufts of grass will liven the place up significantly. To tell the truth, I'm not sure that using real cartoons as reference here is even a good idea, because cartoon backgrounds, for the most part, are meant to be non-distracting to the general movement and set the stage for animated characters. Video games, on the other hand, are inherently an interactive medium, and in most of them you actually personally explore the world around you, and so the density of cool things to look at per square meter should be naturally higher. And that's doubly true for adventure games, because they rarely feature any kind of action apart from maybe cutscenes. I do think that minimalism can work for game environments, even in adventure games, but a lot of stars need to align for just a few assets to suddenly become very emotionally evocative for most people. Usually it's a deliberate artistic choice to create an atmosphere of loneliness, isolation, or absurdity, or in the case of Puzzle Agent, all three. I suppose it also works for games employing pixel art and any sort of deliberately retro graphics, because something in our monkey brains just fills in the gaps and the picture looks finished even though it's just a few colored squares. And so to summarize, the best looking locations of Apopia, in my opinion, are the ones that have objects that have easily recognizable imagery and have a more lived-in feel, like this circus tent, for example. However, this specific environment is actually a good segue to talk about my other issue with the backgrounds, namely how strangely different parts of it work together. Looking back at some of the earlier promo art for Apopia makes it clear that the art direction for it used to be slightly different back in 2018. It's understandable why developers would want to move away from it, but I do think that this previous version didn't suffer from looking like it has conflicting elements. Both the characters and the environment are rendered very similarly in terms of color, everything is outlined with just about the same brush, it's sketchier and less moody, but it also looks like a game with a more solid stylistic identity. Meanwhile, in the demo you have things like this vending machine, which for some reason uses gradients for shading, doesn't have the same gritty texture as the rest of the props, and also has outlines 3 times thicker than anything near it. It's like something you could see in a Flash game, honestly. I do empathize with the tricky problem of effectively and organically highlighting specific objects in your game world. This problem is so pervasive in animation that it has its own TV tropes page, so I'm not going to pretend like it's in any way a simple task that doesn't require a lot of creative decision making. But I do think it's worth closely examining your art style to compile a clear, preferably documented list of what kind of techniques and visual shortcuts you can or can't have in the game. You should decide what's your main color palette, what is your way of drawing shadows, do they have soft edges or hard edges? Are you drawing with gritty, textured brushes or clean and smooth ones? Can you use gradients? Why or why not? What are you trying to achieve with this one specific technique? Can you achieve the same or better result by employing another technique? Just things like that. A lot of simple, precise, style-defining questions to yourself. And a lot of them, unfortunately, you will only find answers to by doing lots of studies. User interface is something that I think I've felt the strongest about. It's rather uneven across the game as well, and to illustrate this, look at how many fonts you have. Most video games, I would strongly argue, don't need more than 2 or maybe 3. I've counted at least 6 in Apopia, which for an hour-long video game that doesn't seem to step into any kind of postmodern territory is entirely too many fonts, in my opinion. Even a matter of artistic preference completely aside, it's just a localization nightmare waiting to happen. If you have a font that's commonly used for speech bubbles, why use any other font when anyone speaks or thinks? You already have color coordination to differentiate major characters, so don't highlight a select few of them at the cost of having a less consistent art style. And while I'm on the topic of speech bubbles, I would strongly advise to choose a different typeface for them altogether. The one you have now looks decent for things like captions and titles, but isn't actually very readable as a wall of text. There's a lot of better fitting ones out there, both free and commercial, and it is absolutely worth it to invest both time and money in finding a better font, especially when you have a narrative-driven game and letters on a screen is your main narrative delivery device. It has to be nice to look at. Also worth mentioning that it feels like speech bubbles aren't always considered in the overall composition of the scene. You can often see them sort of awkwardly flying somewhere in the corner without any spacing from the edges, and sometimes, like in the screenshot, they even overlap characters, even the ones that are currently speaking. I know that positioning something like that is very fiddly, annoying, and in general not a part of making video games that anyone looks forward to. But details like these do make a difference in the perceived production quality of your game. For example, on how to treat your speech bubbles in regards to your screen space, apart from picking up actual comic books, I would heavily recommend playing Night in the Woods, both because it's amazing and because it's a game that has a very strong understanding of framing scenes efficiently. Vertical menus, like the ones in the main menu and in the action choice window, have a problem where it's very hard and occasionally just impossible to know which item is currently selected. For the action window, the only indication is a change of scale, and when you only have 2 available options, which is quite often, there is literally no way to determine if the game highlights your selection by increasing or decreasing the size. So I think you need to give your selected items a more sort of commonly understood visual cue of being active, like an underline, a different background, or just have a small arrow that acts as your cursor. You can also notice that I've changed the background color on this window, and that is mostly because, again, it isn't immediately obvious to me why a piece of interface that's very similar in form and function to existing UI would need a change in color, font size, and even transparency. I didn't think the main menu needed an overpaint. The screenshot kind of speaks for itself. This is almost the opposite problem to the one in the choice window. There's too many colors and button styles, and the style consistency falls apart. I was only about 50% sure I was pressing the right button when I opened up the Prologue for the first time. Next, looking at the inventory, it does pack a lot of interesting ideas, like the inventory itself being your hat and your journal being one of the items inside that you just carry. But I'm not sure if that last one is the best way of doing things, because at the moment your to-do list is smaller than every other element on the screen, overshadowed even by the button hint, which is, I would say, a mostly decorative element. Ideally, the most important part of any screen should always be the most visible one. And this is probably creeping over to the game design territory a little bit, but it doesn't seem like there's any reason why the journal can't be its own separate menu with its own button and cute little sketches inside, because, you know, everyone loves a good in-game journal. On that slightly random note, I wrap up my art review. I hope that it was helpful and that it was fair. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the things I liked about the art, but that is mostly due to the time limit on the segment, and I wanted to pack as many productive thoughts as possible. As I've already mentioned in the beginning of the talk, I actually do think you have a very cute and charming game in your hands, and I would very much love to play the full version once it's out. Big thank you to tinyBuild, Owl Studio, and the DevGAMM team for making this review possible, and obviously to Quillo Games for submitting their demo. If you have any questions, I will always be happy to answer them, both now and later if you write to me on email or Twitter.